The apartment was too quiet for how fast my heart was beating. I was sitting on the edge of my kitchen counter, arms crossed, watching a woman I had never met sleep on my second-hand couch. She was curled on her side in a dark green wrap dress, one heel still on, the other somewhere near the coffee table. The room smelled like cedar gin and somebody else's perfume. She had been crying before she fell asleep. I could see it in the mascara dried under one eye, but her breathing now was slow and steady, and that was the only thing in the room that made any sense. Her phone was sitting face up on the cushion beside her. I hadn't been watching it, but when the screen lit up, the name was impossible to miss. Dad, Rowan. And below the name a contact photo, same square jaw, same silver hair I'd been careful not to stare at for 3 months across a boardroom table. My name is Gavin Reese. I'm 37 years old. I'm a structural engineer at Caldwell Development Group in Vancouver. Commercial towers, mixed-use builds, the occasional heritage retrofit. I grew up in Kamloops where my dad drove a water truck for the oil patch and my mom worked reception at a dental clinic. They taught me 2 things: keep your word and don't bring trouble to the door. I had been at Caldwell for 3 months, still on probation, still proving every morning that I deserved the desk they'd given me. Rowan Caldwell ran his company the way a lot of men who'd built things from nothing run them, carefully, with high expectations and very little patience for people who couldn't keep up. He wasn't cruel about it, but he was exacting. You either delivered or you didn't, and if you didn't, you found out quickly. The woman on my couch was his daughter. I should back up. Her name, I would learn later, was Aubrey. But on the night I'm talking about, I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about her, except that she was alone at the far end of the bar at a place in Gastown called the Bottle House. On a Thursday in March, when the rain was coming in off the inlet, the way it does in Vancouver in early spring, sideways and without apology. My colleague Felix had been trying to get me out of the apartment for weeks. Felix had been at Caldwell for 4 years and treated his social life with the same systematic dedication he brought to site inspections. He said I was calcifying. He said that was worse than being sad. I told him I wasn't sad. He said that was exactly the problem. So I went. I nursed a pint of something local near the window, watched the harbor lights blur in the rain, and made polite conversation with whoever stood near me. That's when I noticed her. She was at the far end of the bar, one hand wrapped around a glass that looked like it was probably the 4th of its kind, and she was staring at nothing in the specific way people stare at nothing when something has just happened to them that they haven't fully processed yet. Not sad, exactly. Somewhere past sad and into something quieter and more exhausted. The bartender caught my eye and tilted her head in the woman's direction. The look said, "Do you know her?" I shook my head. Then I walked over anyway. She looked up when I stopped beside her. Her eyes were dark and a little glassy. "I'm fine," she said before I'd said anything. I told her I believed her. I asked if she needed water. "I need another one of these." "The bartender doesn't think so." She glanced toward the bar, then back at me. "Did she deputize you?" I volunteered. She almost smiled. Almost. A few minutes later she tried to stand and the stool caught her. The leg slipped on the rubber mat and she went sideways fast. I caught her by the elbow before she went down. She grabbed my arm to steady herself, and for a moment we were just standing there in the middle of a crowded bar, while the rain drummed the windows. I asked where she lived. "Dunbar," she said, "or near there, west side. There's a coffee shop on the corner." That wasn't enough to put into a GPS. I stood in the parking lane on Water Street with rain soaking through my jacket and a stranger who couldn't tell me a street number. 2 choices. Leave her at the bar with a bartender who was done serving her for the night, and hope for the best, or take her somewhere I knew was safe. I chose the second option and immediately understood why I would regret it either way. My apartment was in Mount Pleasant, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of an older walk-up, functional boiler, good bones, a landlord who fixed things when asked. The floors were Douglas fir, worn smooth in the traffic paths. The furniture was secondhand. I hadn't done much to make it feel like anything in particular since my relationship with Melissa ended 8 months before, which meant the place had the particular blankness of somewhere a person lives, but hasn't quite settled into yet. I helped Aubrey up the stairs, sat her on the couch, pulled the throw blanket from the back of it and draped it over her, got a glass of water and the Advil from the medicine cabinet, set both on the coffee table, took the heel that had come off and placed it beside her bag. Then I tore a page from the notepad I kept by the kitchen phone and wrote 5 lines. "You're safe. This is my apartment in Mount Pleasant. I'm in the other room with the door closed. Take the water and the Advil when you wake up. Gavin." I folded the note and set it against the glass. That was when her phone lit up on the cushion beside her. Dad, Rowan. And the contact photo that matched exactly the face I'd been careful not to stare at during 3 months of Monday morning project reviews. I stood in my own living room and felt the specific cold of a mistake you haven't made yet, but can already see coming toward you. I went to the second bedroom, closed the door, and lay on the floor with a pillow and my spare blanket, because taking the bed felt too comfortable for what I'd just walked into, and sleeping on the living room floor felt like standing watch over someone, which felt wrong in a different direction. I was awake until past 2. I stared at the ceiling and thought about every version of how Monday morning could go, and none of them were good. I was up before she was. My back told me immediately and specifically how it felt about the hardwood. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the early fog sit on the North Shore Mountains, the way it does on spring mornings before the sun burns through. The couch creaked, then slow footsteps, then silence, which meant she'd found the note. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding the folded piece of paper. One strap of her dress had slipped. Her hair was tangled on one side. She looked like someone doing a careful inventory of the past 12 hours and finding several items she couldn't account for. "Gavin," she said. I nodded. "You brought me to your apartment." "You couldn't give me a street number," I said. "I slept in the other room. Nothing happened." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I started thinking about whether offering coffee would be awkward. Then she said, "Most people would have just called a cab to nowhere and hoped for the best." "That's not a plan," I said. "That's optimism with no evidence." She almost smiled again. This time she let it through. She called a rideshare, gathered her bag, checked her phone, and I watched the exact moment she saw the missed call from her father and the small, careful way she put the phone face down in her bag without reacting. She thanked me at the door, genuinely and without embarrassment, and walked downstairs. I thought that was the end of it. A strange evening. A story I'd never tell anyone, especially not at work. Monday morning, Felix was in the hallway outside the engineering bay when I arrived. He had the look of someone who already knows something interesting. "Caldwell's daughter is in the building," he said quietly. "Has been since 8. I looked through the glass partition toward the main corridor. She was walking with 2 people from the planning team, blazer buttoned, hair pulled back, posture completely different from the woman who'd held my arm to stop herself from going sideways 3 nights before. She carried a portfolio under one arm. She moved through the office with the ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was. Her eyes moved across the engineering floor, across the drafting tables, the monitors, the people, and paused on me. 1 beat. Then she turned and kept walking. She had recognized me. I had recognized the exact moment she chose not to show it. The official reason for Aubrey's presence at Caldwell Development that week was a design review she was leading for the Burrard Street project, a mixed-use tower the firm was developing in the West End. She was a design consultant. She had legitimate reasons to be in the building. But she started coming to the engineering floor. She asked me questions about lateral load requirements and transfer slab specifications that were specific enough that she had to sit beside me at my desk while I answered them. She brought coffee one morning for the whole team from the place on Main Street, the good kind, in a cardboard carrier with a handwritten order on each cup, and mine said black, no sugar, without her having confirmed it with me. She asked Felix, never me, whether I usually stayed late on Fridays. One afternoon I walked into the glass-walled meeting room to find her portfolio sitting alone on the table. Everyone else had cleared out. I picked it up and carried it down the hall to the planning suite. When I handed it to her, she took it with the smallest smile. "I keep misplacing that around this building," she said. It was half a joke, but only half. I went back to my desk and thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening and again the next morning. The trust between us built in ways nobody else in the building would have noticed. I saw that the adjustable monitor arm at her temporary workstation was bent at the wrong angle. It would give someone a headache by noon every day without them knowing why. I waited until she'd gone home and spent 10 minutes with an Allen key getting it right. The next morning there was a post-it on my monitor. "The setup is perfect now. You notice things." I read it twice and put it in my desk drawer. One evening late, when the cleaning crew had already been through, and the building was lit only by desk lamps and the orange glow of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I found her in the project library sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by site drawings, shoes off, cold cup of tea in her hands. She told me about Preston. Preston's family ran a resource company out of Calgary. His father and Rowan had done business together for years, and somewhere in the logic of that friendship it had been decided, quietly and persistently, that Preston and Aubrey made sense. They had been together for 18 months. She had played the role expected of her. Dinners, functions, long weekends in Whistler with both families, because the expectation was everywhere and stepping out of it would have meant disappointing people she loved. But Preston was careful in the way that some people are careful, not with others but with appearances. He tracked her location on her phone and explained it as concern. He decided who she could see and explained it as protection. He made her feel, slowly and without dramatic incident, like she was a part of his life that needed to be managed, rather than a person he was choosing to love. She had ended things the Thursday before the night at the bar. "I didn't go out that night to get drunk," she said, looking at the drawings in her lap. "I went out because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I just handed back 2 years of my life, and I didn't know what came next." She paused. "And then the first person I met was you." I didn't say anything. I sat with the weight of that sentence for a while. A few days later, Rowan called me into his office. The conversation was technically about the Burrard Street project, but before I reached the door on my way out, he stopped me. "I keep my professional relationships and my personal ones in separate rooms, Reese," he said, watching me over his reading glasses. "I'd expect the same from everyone in this building." It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a threat. But it landed like something heavy set down on a glass surface. I nodded and walked out, and didn't look toward the planning suite for the rest of the week. Felix noticed. "You and the boss's daughter have a lot of conversations on the engineering floor lately," he said. "Over lunch at the spot on Broadway we went to on Fridays." I told him it was Project Overlap. He put down his fork. "Sure," he said, "Project Overlap." I changed the subject. But that night in my apartment, sitting on the couch where she had slept, I asked myself honestly what I thought I was doing. Preston came back on a Tuesday. He walked into Caldwell Development under the cover of a business introduction, something between his family's company and a land acquisition Rowan's firm was exploring. He was tall and well-dressed, the kind of person who'd learned early that confidence reads as competence if you commit to it fully enough. He worked the room like he already owned it. When he saw Aubrey standing near my desk reviewing a set of revised drawings I'd printed for her, his expression didn't change, but something behind it did. I caught it the way you catch something moving in your peripheral vision, there for a fraction of a second, then gone. Preston hadn't come for a business meeting. He went to Rowan's office first. I was at my desk, the door was half open. Preston leaned against the frame with the posture of a man who had decided exactly what he was going to say and how. "Rowan," he said. His voice was pitched just loud enough to carry. "I'm not sure you know this. One of your engineers took Aubrey to his apartment in the middle of the night a few weeks back." He let the words sit in the air. He didn't add anything, didn't soften them or explain them. He didn't need to. The words, arranged in exactly that order, did all the damage by themselves. The bar, the rain, the address she couldn't give me, the water on the coffee table, the note, the floor I'd slept on, all of it removed, surgically, cleanly, leaving only an engineer and the boss's daughter and a night. I sat at my desk with a pencil in my hand and felt my pulse in my jaw. Preston found me alone in the stairwell an hour later. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, voice almost friendly. "You know how this looks," he said. "It doesn't matter what actually happened. It matters what people picture when they hear it." I said nothing. My hands were in my pockets and I was counting my own breaths. He had found security footage from my building's entrance, 12 seconds from the camera above the front door grainy, showing me steadying Aubrey through the door with my hand at her waist. No audio, no note, no Advil, no floor. Just an image that, without everything surrounding it, was exactly what he needed it to be. He sent it to Rowan that afternoon. By 4 o'clock I was sitting across from Rowan in his corner office on the 14th floor. The clip was frozen on his laptop. He wasn't angry. He was something harder to read. A father trying to give someone a fair hearing while every instinct was pulling him somewhere else entirely. "Explain this," he said. So I did, beginning. Felix dragging me out. The bar on Water Street. Her on the stool and the address she couldn't give me. The couch, the water, the Advil, the note, the second bedroom floor. The contact photo I hadn't seen until she was already asleep. Rowan listened without interrupting. The silence after I finished was long enough that I became aware of the ventilation humming and the muffled traffic 14 floors below. Then, "I'll speak with Aubrey." "You should," I said. And for what it's worth, I didn't know who she was when I made that decision. I made it because it was the only one I could live with. He didn't respond to that. The next morning I was reassigned, pulled from Burrard Street, moved to a commercial renovation site out in 40 minutes from the main office. No connection to anything I'd been working on. Felix texted at noon, "Heard you got moved, what happened?" I typed back, "I'll explain later." I never did. I sat in a site trailer and thought about the water glass and the 5 lines on a torn notepad page, and how a true thing can be completely destroyed if you remove enough of the context that makes it true. A truth without its context isn't a truth anymore. It's just an accusation that's learned to dress better. Aubrey found out what had happened the same day. She walked into her father's office at 4:30, closed the door behind her, and told him everything. About Preston, the location tracking, the quiet control, the 18 months she had spent performing a relationship she had never truly chosen. About the night she ended it. About the bar and not knowing where else to go. About waking up on a stranger's couch with a handwritten note that said she was safe, and water on the table, and someone who had slept on the floor of his own apartment so she wouldn't have anything to be afraid of. And about what she hadn't told anyone else yet. She had known who I was before that night. Felix had pointed me out at a firm event a month earlier. The new guy on the engineering team, he'd said, "Good work, too quiet for his own good." She'd noticed, she'd looked me up in the company directory afterward, read through the projects I'd worked on, thought about me in the way you think about someone you haven't spoken to, but somehow already feel like you know something about. The night she ended things with Preston, she knew from someone in his circle that Felix's group was heading to Gastown that Thursday. She went to that bar because she knew I'd probably be there. She hadn't planned to drink that much, hadn't planned to forget her own street, hadn't planned any of the rest of it. But she had planned to be in the same room as me. Rowan listened to all of it without interrupting. He was not happy, not by any measure, but he listened, and that, Aubrey told me later, was more than she'd expected from him on the subject of her personal life. 3 weeks went by. I drove out to Surrey every morning in the dark. I buried myself in the renovation, load-bearing wall documentation, concrete core samples, coordination with the trades. I worked late. I ate lunch at a plastic table in a site trailer. I did not reach out to Aubrey and she did not reach out to me. The line Rowan had drawn was clear, and I had no intention of stepping over it unilaterally. Then she showed up at my door on a Wednesday evening. No makeup, hair loose, an oversized flannel shirt over old jeans. She was holding a brown paper bag from the Vietnamese place 2 blocks from my building, the one with the lineup around the corner, on weekends. "You probably eat alone most nights," she said. "I do." "So do I." We sat on the floor of the living room because my kitchen table had 3 weeks of site drawings and coffee cups on it. And neither of us suggested moving anything. She opened the containers, faux spring rolls, something with lemongrass. She handed me chopsticks and we ate in the half-dark of the kitchen light, coming through the doorway, on the same Douglas fir where I'd slept the first night. She noticed. She looked down at the floor beneath her, then back at me. "Is this where you slept?" she asked quietly. "Yes." She went still for a long time, ate slowly, turned something over in her mind the way people do when they're deciding whether to say the thing they actually came to say. Then she set her chopsticks down carefully on the edge of the container, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, open and a little afraid. The way you look right before you hand someone something that could break if they chose to use it that way. I need to tell you what I told my dad, she said. Stop dieting. She told me everything, the firm event, looking me up in the directory, knowing I'd be at that bar, the decision to go, without knowing what would happen next. I wasn't only running away from something that night, she said. I was moving towards something. I just didn't understand it clearly enough yet to say it out loud. I sat there with cold pho in my lap and looked at the woman who had just rewritten the most disorienting night of the past year. If we do this, I said slowly, your dad could pull my contract, you understand that? She looked at me without blinking. If he pulls someone's contract for treating his daughter with basic decency, that tells you everything about whether you were working for the right firm to begin with. I didn't have an answer to that. She stayed until past 10. We rinsed the containers and stood in my narrow kitchen with our shoulders almost touching, not saying much. At the door, she turned back. I left my portfolio on your counter, she said, on purpose. She went down the stairs. I stood with my hand on the doorknob and didn't move for a moment. Outside, the rain had started again, the soft kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself, it just arrives and settles in. The first 2 months were quiet and entirely ours. She came by after work. She brought wine, occasionally groceries, once a very specific Allen key she'd found at the hardware store because she'd remembered something I'd said offhand about the kitchen tap. I cooked. She read on the couch with her feet pulled under her while I spread sight drawings across the living room floor and worked through calculations in the lamplight. She started leaving things: a toothbrush, a pair of soft slippers by the front door, a paperback on the coffee table with a transit receipt as a bookmark, and the sketchbook, the small one she carried everywhere, the one she drew in during meetings and on the SkyTrain and in the quiet before bed. She left it on the kitchen shelf where it stayed between visits. That sketchbook had been with her the night at the bar. Leaving it where I could see it every day was not an accident, and we both understood that. She knew which drawer in my kitchen stuck if you pulled it straight, rather than slightly upward. She knew the bathroom light took 4 seconds to warm up. She knew the third step from the top on the staircase outside creaked on the left side and not the right. She knew these things because she paid attention, and she paid attention because she was choosing to stay. 3 months in, Rowan called and asked me to meet him for lunch, a quiet place near Robson Street. I drove there expecting to be told my contract wasn't being renewed. He ordered the halibut. He looked at me across the table for a long time before speaking. Aubrey told me everything, he said. About Preston, about that night, about the way things actually were. He was quiet long enough for the server to bring bread and disappear. I don't like it, he said. I want you to know that clearly. Then, after a pause, but I respect that you told me the truth when I asked, and I respect that you made the decision you made without knowing who she was. He didn't offer his blessing, didn't shake my hand or tell me he was happy about any of it. He said he respected the truth, and at that point in my life, standing inside something that could still cost me everything, that single sentence was enough to stand on. Preston tried one final time, about a month after that lunch. He forwarded the parking garage clip to Rowan again, with a note questioning the firm's judgment keeping me on. Rowan forwarded it to me the same afternoon with one line: "This was addressed 3 months ago. Focus on your work." That was the moment I understood Rowan had made his decision. Not because he liked the situation, and not because he'd chosen me specifically, but because he'd weighed what he knew against the story built to damage it, and he'd chosen what he knew. That was the most Rowan thing he could have done, and it was the first time I felt certain I was standing on ground that wasn't going to shift. 6 months into the job, I completed the largest project of my contract, a structural retrofit of a heritage building on Granville Island. 4 months of work made permanent in new steel and carefully poured concrete, with the original bones intact. At the completion walkthrough, Rowan stood in the main atrium, talked about the work and the team, and said my name clearly and without hesitation. Aubrey was in the back of the group. When the applause settled and everyone turned back to the building, she looked at me with an expression nobody else in that atrium could have translated. But I knew exactly what it meant. It was the same thing she'd been saying quietly for months, through slippers and a sketchbook and an Allen key. and a portfolio left on purpose on a kitchen counter. I see you, I'm not going anywhere. At 10 months, she moved in. Not to her father's place in West Vancouver, with the view of the Lions Gate and the heated floors. To my apartment in Mount Pleasant with the worn Douglas fir and the staircase that creaked and the kitchen tap that still dripped slightly if you didn't turn the handle all the way. She arrived on a Saturday morning in November with 2 suitcases and the sketchbook. I stood in the doorway and watched her come up the stairs with the last bag. When she set it down in the living room, I said, "You're leaving a house in West Van for a 3rd-floor walk-up." She went to the kitchen shelf, picked up the sketchbook, and placed it carefully beside the toaster, the same spot it had occupied during every visit for months. "I'm not leaving anything," she said. "I'm arriving." The sketchbook stayed on that shelf, not misplaced, not delivered through anyone else, not left anywhere by accident, placed there by a woman who had spent a long time holding everything carefully and guarding herself behind controlled smiles and careful arrangements, and who had finally found somewhere ordinary enough and steady enough to simply set things down. That second-hand couch, the gray one with the arm that creaks if you shift your weight quickly, she reads on it every Sunday morning with her knees pulled up and going cold on the end table beside her. Same cushions, same room. Same rain against the same windows. Everything else arranged differently than it was before. I think about that night sometimes. I sit on this couch and let myself go back to the version of me standing in a bar in Gastown watching a woman I'd never met try to stand up and almost fall, and making a decision in about 4 seconds that I had no way of understanding at the time. I could have stayed where I was. I could have told the bartender and left. That would have been easier. That would have been the sensible thing, the clean thing. The thing that would have left my Monday morning untouched. Instead, I helped her to the door. I drove her somewhere safe. I wrote 5 lines on a notepad that said she was not alone, and then I lay on the floor of my own apartment so that a stranger could sleep without anything to be afraid of. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not everything that came after, the reassignment, the parking garage footage, the man who tried to take 12 seconds of video and use it to end something before it had the chance to begin. Not even Aubrey telling me she'd walked into that bar because of me, which still does something unexpected to my chest when I think about it too directly. Just the note, the water, the 5 lines. I didn't do anything heroic that night. I just decided that someone else's safety mattered more than my convenience, and then I followed through on it. I stayed 1 more minute when every practical instinct was telling me to leave. Sometimes that's the whole thing. Sometimes staying 1 more minute is what changes the direction of everything. If you've ever done the right thing and paid for it before the truth had time to catch up, I want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I put out a new story every single week. Have you ever helped a stranger and only understood later what that choice actually cost you, and what it gave you back?